The birth of a legend. On September 8, 1157, in the lands of Oxford, England, was born the one who would be known as the greatest warrior of Christendom. Richard, the third son of the powerful Henry II and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, came into the world destined for greatness. But no one could have imagined that this baby would become a living legend, a king who would rarely set foot on English soil, but who would be eternally remembered as the Lionheart. If you are enjoying this epic story, leave your like now. This is the most amazing story you will hear today. From childhood, Richard demonstrated something different. While other boys played with wooden swords, he was already studying military strategies with frightening intensity. His mother, Eleanor, one of the most powerful and cultured women in medieval Europe, recognized a special spark in him. She educated him not only in the arts of war, but also in poetry, music, and the Provençal language. Richard grew up speaking French, for his true homeland was Aquitaine, not England. At 15, Richard was already commanding his own troops. That's right, a teenager leading armies in real battles. He was named Duke of Aquitaine, a vast territory in southern France that belonged to his family, and it was there in those sunny lands that the young prince learned the true face of war. His first great test came when rebellious barons challenged his authority. Richard did not hesitate. At only 16 years old, he mounted his war horse, gathered his knights, and marched against the rebels' fortified castles. One by one, the fortresses fell before his calculated fury. He was not only courageous, he was brilliant. He knew every siege technique, every weakness in the stone walls. But Richard's life wasn't all glory. His relationship with his father, King Henry II, was explosive. The old king was possessive and distrustful of his own children. Richard, proud and ambitious, refused to be treated as a subordinate. This family tension would culminate in one of the greatest betrayals in medieval history. In 1173, when Richard was only 16 years old, he joined his brothers Henry the Younger and Geoffrey in a rebellion against their father. Encouraged by their mother Eleanor, who was fed up with King Henry II and his mistresses, the young princes took up arms. The ensuing civil war tore England and France apart. Castles burned, villages were sacked, and blood flowed across the green fields of Normandy. The rebellion failed. Henry II, despite his age, proved to be a formidable adversary. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned for over 15 years. Yes, the king imprisoned his own wife. Richard and his brothers were forced to beg forgiveness, kneeling before their father in a scene of public humiliation. But in that moment of defeat, something crystallized in Richard's heart, an unwavering hatred of weakness and an ironclad determination never to be subjugated again. The following years molded Richard into a ruthless warrior. He returned to Aquitaine and ruled with an iron fist. He tolerated no disloyalty. When barons rebelled, Richard personally marched with his army. He participated in battles on the front lines, something rare for the nobility of the time. While other nobles watched from afar, Richard was there, sword in hand, breastplate stained with blood, inspiring his men with his insane courage. His fame began to spread. Minstrels sang of the prince who fought like 10. Men who never retreated, who preferred death to accepting dishonor. Richard the Lionheart, the nickname arose at that time, given by those who witnessed his supernatural bravery in battles. But Richard had a dream greater than ruling castles and lands. Since childhood, he had heard stories about Jerusalem, the holy city that had fallen into the hands of the Muslim Sultan Saladin in 1187. For a medieval Christian knight, there was no nobler mission than liberating the Holy Sepulchre, and Richard swore he would do it, whatever the cost. The road to the throne. In 1189, everything changed. King Henry II, aged and ill, faced yet another rebellion, this time led by Richard himself, who had allied himself with King Philip II of France, his childhood friend and future mortal rival. The war was brutal and swift. Henry, betrayed even by his favourite son, John Lackland, was defeated and humiliated. It is said that, on his deathbed, Henry II received a list of all the nobles who had turned against him. The first name on the list was John, his youngest and favourite son. The king, devastated by the betrayal, is said to have murmured his last words, "Let everything go as it goes. I care no more about anything," and he died of heartbreak. Richard was 32 years old when he became King of England. And do you know how many months he would spend in his kingdom during his 10-year reign? Only 6 months. That's right. The King of England practically didn't know England. For Richard, that cold and distant kingdom was merely a source of resources to finance his true passion, war and the Crusade. His coronation on September 3rd, 1189, at Westminster Abbey was magnificent. Richard was imposing, tall, with golden red hair, piercing blue eyes, and the bearing of a war god. Chroniclers of the time described him as the most handsome man in Christendom, but beauty was not his greatest quality. It was his absolute determination. Immediately after his coronation, Richard began selling. Everything, literally everything. Castles, titles, lands, offices, anything that could be converted into gold to finance the Third Crusade. He reportedly said, "I would sell London if I could find a buyer." It wasn't greed. It was obsession. Jerusalem was calling him. But before leaving for the Holy Land, Richard had unfinished business. His father had promised to marry him to Alix, sister of King Philip II of France. However, there was a problem. Alix had been Henry II's mistress. Richard, disgusted, refused to marry his father's former mistress. This created tension with Philip, but Richard had a solution. He married Berengaria of Navarre, a princess he barely knew, and whom, it is said, he never loved. The marriage was purely political. Richard needed allies and stability before going to war. Berengaria was beautiful and noble, but Richard had other priorities. His heart belonged to glory and battle. In 1190, Richard set off on the crusade, but his journey to the Holy Land would be as epic as the crusade itself. Crossing France towards the Mediterranean, Richard met Philip II. The two kings, allies and rivals, swore to conquer Jerusalem together, but this alliance was destined to break. Richard's fleet sailed across the Mediterranean, but a violent storm scattered his ships. Some ended up on the island of Cyprus, where the local ruler, Isaac Comnenus, a bizarre tyrant who declared himself emperor, captured the shipwrecked and plundered the ships. Worse still, Richard's fiancée Berengaria was on one of those ships. When Richard learned what had happened, his fury was indescribable. He landed in Cyprus with his army and declared war on Isaac. In just 3 weeks, Richard conquered the entire island. That's right, an entire kingdom fell in less than a month. Isaac tried to escape but was captured. Richard, with his dark sense of humor, granted Isaac's request not to be chained with iron and instead bound him with silver chains. Cyprus had become a crucial, strategic base for the Crusades and a valuable source of income. But Richard had no time to lose. Jerusalem awaited. In June 1191, Richard finally arrived in Acre, in the Holy Land. The city had been besieged for 2 years by Christian forces, but the Crusaders were exhausted, sick, and lacked effective leadership. Richard's arrival changed everything. It was as if a lightning bolt had struck the battlefield. Ricardo took command personally. Even sick with a fever, probably scurvy, he directed the siege from a stretcher, shouting orders and calculating every movement of the war machines. His catapults and ballistae devastated the walls of Acre day and night. The city had no chance. On July 12, 1191, just 1 month after Richard's arrival, Acre surrendered. The Third Crusade had its first great triumph, and Richard the Lionheart proved that his nickname was not an exaggeration. But the victory at Acre brought a controversy that would tarnish Richard's reputation: the terms of surrender. included the release of Christian prisoners and the payment of a ransom. When Saladin delayed part of the payment, Richard made a brutal decision. He ordered the execution of some 2,700 Muslim prisoners in front of the city walls. This atrocity shocked even medieval standards. Richard justified it by claiming he couldn't feed so many prisoners and that Saladin had broken the agreement. But the truth is that Richard wanted to send a message. He took no prisoners. He didn't negotiate. It was total war. The duel of giants. Ricardo versus Saladino. After the fall of Acre, Richard marched towards Jerusalem. Before him lay the greatest challenge of his life. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, considered one of the greatest military strategists of all time. The confrontation between these two titans would define the fate of the Holy Land. Saladin was no ordinary enemy. Born in Iraq in 1137, he had unified the Muslim world and reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. He was intelligent, honorable, and respected even by his enemies. Christian chroniclers of the time described him with admiration, something rare when speaking of Muslims. Saladin was a worthy adversary for Richard. The first major battle between Richard and Saladin took place at Arsuf on September 7, 1191. Richard marched along the coast with about 12,000 men, while Saladin pursued him with a superior army. The Sultan planned to destroy the Crusaders in open field, where his light cavalry had the advantage. The day dawned hot and muggy. Dust covered everything. The Crusaders marched in close formation, shields raised under the scorching sun. Suddenly the Muslim war drums echoed. Thousands of Arab horsemen appeared on the hills, shouting and hurling arrows like a deadly rain. Richard had ordered that no one break formation until his signal. He knew that if his knights attacked prematurely, they would be isolated and massacred. But the pressure was unbearable. Arrows pierced shields. Men fell, horses neighed in pain. The hospitallers in the rear were the most severely affected. Finally, when the tension was unbearable, Richard gave the signal. The trumpet sounded. The Crusader knights lowered their lances and charged. It was like an avalanche of iron and fury. The heavy European cavalry, mounted on enormous war horses, crushed the Muslim lines. Saladin's cavalry, accustomed to fighting with hit-and-run tactics, had no defense against the Crusaders' frontal charge. Ricardo led, personally, his sword gleaming in the sun, cutting through enemies like wheat. Witnesses recount that he was everywhere at once, saving surrounded soldiers, reorganizing lines, inspiring terror in the enemy. He was superhuman. The Battle of Arsuf ended in an overwhelming victory for Richard. Saladin's army retreated in disarray, leaving thousands dead on the field. But Richard had lost his chance to completely annihilate the enemy. The Muslims managed to regroup, and Saladin, although defeated, still controlled Jerusalem. In the following months, Richard continued his march. He recaptured Jaffa, defeated Saladin in several minor skirmishes, and came dangerously close to Jerusalem. Twice he came so close to the holy city that he could see it on the horizon, and twice he retreated. Why didn't Richard, the greatest warrior of his time, attack Jerusalem? The reason was military. His advisors, especially the knights who knew the region, warned him, even if they conquered the city, it would be impossible to hold it. Jerusalem was inland, far from the coast, surrounded by enemy territory. Supply lines would be cut, the army would be besieged and destroyed. Richard, despite his legendary courage, was not suicidal. He understood strategy. Reconquering Jerusalem only to lose it weeks later would be worse than not conquering it at all. He first needed to completely weaken Saladin, conquer more territories, and build fortifications. But time was against him. While Richard fought in the Holy Land, terrible news arrived from Europe. His ally Philip II of France had returned home, claiming illness, and was now plotting to seize Richard's lands in France. Worse still, his brother John Lackland was plotting to usurp the English throne. Richard was being stabbed in the back while fighting for Christendom. The pressure was unbearable. Richard tried to negotiate with Saladin. The two never met in person, but they exchanged messages and gifts. They developed a strange and profound mutual respect. Richard even proposed that his sister Joanna marry Saladin's brother, uniting the two royal houses. The proposal was rejected, but it demonstrated Richard's diplomatic creativity. In August 1192, Richard was in Jaffa when he learned that Saladin had taken the city by surprise. With only 54 knights and a few infantry soldiers, Richard landed on the beach and directly attacked Saladin's army. The audacity was insane, 50 knights against thousands. But Richard understood the psychology of war. He attacked with such violence and speed that the Muslims thought a large army had arrived. Richard personally killed dozens of enemies, his sword never stopping. The Crusaders retook Jaffa in a few hours. It was one of the most impressive military feats of the Middle Ages. Days later, Saladin attempted to recapture Jaffa in a surprise night attack. Richard was awakened by cries of alarm. With no time to don armor, wearing only a tunic, he mounted his horse and gathered his men. With only 15 mounted knights and 300 infantry soldiers, Richard formed a defensive line on the beach. What happened next defies logic. Saladin attacked with thousands of knights. Richard ordered the infantry to plant their spears in the ground, creating a barrier of spikes. He and his 15 knights stood behind, ready to counterattack any opening. Waves of Muslim cavalry crashed against the wall of spears. Richard galloped back and forth across the line, killing any enemy who managed to get past. The battle lasted for hours. When it ended, the Muslims retreated. Richard had defended Jaffa against an entire army with a handful of men. This battle broke the will of both sides. Saladin realized he could not expel Richard. Richard realized he could not conquer Jerusalem. In September 1192, the two giants signed the Peace of Ramla. Jerusalem would remain Muslim, but Christian pilgrims would have free access to the city. The Crusaders would retain control of the coast. Richard never set foot in Jerusalem. When he came so close that he could see the city, he covered his eyes with his shield, saying that he did not deserve to see what he had not conquered. It was one of the most tragic and noble moments of his life. The prison and the rescue. In October 1192, Richard set sail for home. He had left the Holy Land without conquering Jerusalem, but his legend was established. He was recognized as the greatest warrior of Christendom. But his journey back would be as perilous as the crusade. Richard knew he was in danger. Philip II of France and Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had publicly insulted at Acre, wanted his head. The safest route would be through the Mediterranean and then through France. But Philip controlled the French routes. Richard decided to take the risk. He would cross Europe in disguise, passing through the territory of his enemies. It was a catastrophic decision. In December 1192, near Vienna, Richard was recognized and captured by men of Leopold of Austria. The King of England, the Lionheart, was a prisoner. Leopold handed Richard over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who saw a golden opportunity. Keeping a king prisoner was illegal under the laws of the time, especially a crusader under papal protection, but Henry didn't care. He demanded an absurd ransom, 150,000 silver marks, equivalent to twice the annual income of England. While Richard was imprisoned, his brother John Lackland and Philip II of France conspired to divide his lands. John even offered money to the emperor to keep Richard imprisoned indefinitely, his own brother betraying him in the vilest way possible. But Richard was not alone. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now 70 years old, took charge. This extraordinary woman traveled throughout England collecting the ransom. Special taxes were levied. Churches donated their silver treasures. Nobles sold properties. The whole of England was heavily taxed to bring its king back. During his captivity, Richard was not idle. He wrote moving poems about his imprisonment, saying that he only discovered who his true friends were in adversity. He also negotiated with Henry VI, impressing the emperor with his intelligence and dignity. It is said that when Richard was presented at the imperial court, he spoke with such eloquence and nobility that many German nobles sided with him. In February 1194, after 15 months of captivity, the ransom was finally paid. Richard was freed. He was 37 years old and furious. The first thing he did was return to England, for the first time in 4 years, to deal with John's betrayal. John, cowardly as always, fled to France as soon as he learned that Richard was free. But Richard was merciful to the family. When they finally captured John and brought him before the king, Richard simply said, "Don't be afraid, John. You are just a child." John was 27 years old at the time, but Richard forgave him, although he never trusted him again. The real enemy was Philip II of France. While Richard was imprisoned, Philip had invaded Normandy and seized several castles. Now Richard wanted revenge. The last 5 years of his life would be dedicated to recovering what Philip had stolen. The war between Richard and Philip was brutal and relentless. Battle after battle, siege after siege, Richard proved that he was still the greatest military commander in Europe. He repeatedly defeated the French, recaptured castles, and burned villages. Philip, who in his youth had been Richard's friend, now feared and hated him intensely. Richard built a fortress that would become a symbol of his military genius, Château Gaillard. Erected in just 2 years on a cliff above the Seine River, it was considered impregnable. Richard called it "my 1-year-old daughter" and declared that he would defend it even if its walls were made of butter. It was a marvel of medieval military engineering. The fortress had one purpose: to protect Normandy from French attacks. It was in a perfect strategic position and was so well designed that military experts still study its architecture today. Richard personally oversaw every detail of the construction. He was a genius not only in battle, but in military engineering. In 1198, Richard was at the height of his power. He had reconquered almost everything Philip had taken. France was on the defensive. It seemed that nothing could stop the Lionheart. But fate had other plans. In March 1199, Richard was besieging the castle of Chalus-Chabrol, an insignificant fortification in the Limousin mountains. The reason for the siege is disputed. Some say a peasant had found a treasure of Roman gold and Richard wanted to confiscate it. Others say the lord of the castle had rebelled. In any case, it was a routine siege against a minor castle. On the night of March 25th, Richard was inspecting the siege without full armor, wielding only a shield. It was a mistake he would never make. In an important battle, but Chalus was so insignificant that he didn't worry about it. Suddenly a crossbow shot out from the walls. The arrow struck Richard in the shoulder. He tried to pull it out, but the tip broke off and remained lodged there. Initially, Richard didn't think much of it. It was just a superficial wound. He returned to his tent, but the wound became infected. In the following days, the infection spread. Gangrene. Richard, the invincible warrior, was dying from a stupid wound. In an insignificant siege against a minor castle. The irony was cruel. What we know for sure is that Ricardo was a complex and contradictory man. He could be brutal, executing thousands of prisoners in Acre without hesitation, but he could also be magnanimous, forgiving the man who killed him. He was a sensitive poet who wrote in Provençal about courtly love, but also a bloodthirsty warrior who fought on the front lines with savage pleasure. Richard was deeply religious, like all men of his time, but his faith was pragmatic. He went on crusade not only out of devotion, but for glory and adventure. He confessed his sins when convenient, but returned to committing them without remorse. He was medieval to the bone. He lived in a world of moral absolutes that would seem incomprehensible to us today. His relationship with money was notorious. Richard spent fortunes on wars, but he was also generous with his knights and soldiers. He understood that loyalty was bought not only with leadership, but with gold. His mercenaries were the best paid in Europe, and therefore fought with a ferocity that terrified their enemies. Propaganda was also one of Richard's weapons. He cultivated his image as a warrior king. He wore magnificent clothes in battle, rode spectacular horses, and used weapons decorated with gold. He wanted to be seen, recognized, remembered, and he succeeded. Centuries later, we still talk about Richard the Lionheart. His untimely death shaped his legend. Had he lived another 20 years, perhaps his reputation would have been different. Perhaps he would have lost battles, aged, shown weakness. But he died at his peak, still undefeated on the battlefield, still feared and admired. Death at 41 crystallized his image forever. When John Lackland ascended the throne, everything quickly crumbled. John was everything Richard was not: a coward, a traitor, militarily incompetent. Within a few years, he lost Normandy to Philip II. He lost most of the Plantagenet French possessions. The empire that his father Henry II and his brother Richard had built vanished. The English began to look back with nostalgia. Richard, who had taxed them mercilessly, who had rarely set foot on English soil, became a national hero. The stories about him grew, became embellished, became legendary. He was the perfect king they had lost. Eleanor of Aquitaine, her mother, lived until 1204, witnessing the destruction of the family empire. She was 82 years old. When she died, an impressive age for the time, she spent the last years of her life at Fontevraud Abbey, where she was buried next to Henry II and Richard. The family that had fought so much in life rested together in death. Richard's wife, Berengaria, never returned to England after his death. She lived on the continent managing her estates and died in 1230. She never remarried. She technically remained Queen of England for 31 years after Richard's death, although she held no real power. She was the only English queen who never set foot in England. Chateau Gaillard, Richard's last great work, stood for only 6 years after his death. In 1204, Philip II of France besieged it. Despite its defensive ingenuity, the castle fell after a long and ingenious siege. Richard would have been furious if he had known, but perhaps also impressed by the military creativity required to conquer it. The Crusades continued for another century after Richard's death, but none was as glorious as the third. Jerusalem was never reconquered by the Christians. Saladin died in 1193, just 6 years before Richard, at the age of 55. It is said that he died poor because he had given all his fortune to charity. The two giants who defined their era disappeared within a few years. The legend of Richard the Lionheart has grown through the centuries. In medieval literature, he appears as the ideal king of Robin Hood stories, although these legends are largely fictional. The real Richard never met Robin Hood, who probably didn't even exist, but the association remained. In the 19th century, during the Romantic period, Richard was rediscovered as a romantic hero. Poets, painters, and writers celebrated his courage and his crusades. Sir Walter Scott wrote Ivanhoe, where Richard appears disguised as the Black Knight. The image of Richard in shining armor defending Christendom captured the Victorian imagination. But in the 20th century, historians began to reassess. Yes, Richard was a brilliant warrior, but he was a terrible king. Yes, he was brave, but also cruel and irresponsible. His crusades cost fortunes and achieved little. His absence harmed England. His senseless death in a minor siege demonstrated his recklessness. Today, Richard is viewed with more critical eyes, but he still fascinates. He represents something essential about the Middle Ages: violence, honor, faith, unbridled ambition. He was a man of his time, impossible to judge by modern standards. The eternal legacy of the Lionheart. 800 years after his death, Richard the Lionheart remains one of the most recognizable figures in medieval history. But why? What is it about this king, who spent only 6 months in his kingdom, that still captures our imagination? First, Richard represents the impossible ideal of the warrior king. In the popular imagination, kings were supposed to lead troops, fight battles, and conquer territories. Medieval reality was different. Most kings ruled from afar, delegated military commands, and avoided unnecessary risks. But Richard was different. He actually fought on the front lines. He truly risked his life. He was truly the first to attack and the last to retreat. This has mythical power. We want to believe that leaders should share the dangers they impose on others. Richard did this, sometimes recklessly, but always authentically. He wasn't a hypocrite who sent others to their deaths while remaining safe in the castle. Secondly, Richard lived in a fascinating time of transition. The 12th century was a period of cultural renaissance in Europe. Universities were being founded, Gothic cathedrals were being built, and troubadour literature was flourishing. Richard personified this mixture of warrior brutality and cultural sophistication. He could behead enemies in the morning and compose refined poetry in the afternoon. Third, the rivalry between Richard and Saladin created one of the most powerful narratives in history. Two brilliant warriors from different cultures fighting for the same piece of sacred land, both honorable in their own way, both brutal when necessary, both respecting each other despite being mortal enemies. It's the kind of story Hollywood would love, except it actually happened. The chroniclers of the time, both Christian and Muslim, recorded this mutual respect. There are accounts of Saladin sending fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to Richard when he was ill, of Richard sending gifts and courteous messages to Saladin. They never met in person, but through messengers they built a strange relationship of respectful adversaries. This aspect humanizes the Crusades in a surprising way. We usually think of the Crusades as a brutal clash of civilizations, blind religious fanaticism, and there was a lot of that. But there were also moments of humanity, of recognizing the nobility of the enemy. Richard and Saladin represent this complexity. Fourth, Richard's story is tragically Shakespearean. He had everything: noble birth, physical beauty, military genius, superhuman courage. But he also had tragic flaws: excessive pride, recklessness, an obsession with glory. These flaws destroyed him. He died in a stupid siege because he was too proud to wear full armor. He was betrayed by his brother because he neglected domestic politics. He never conquered Jerusalem because his ambition exceeded his resources. It's a classic story of hubris. Richard flew too close to the sun. His premature and stupid death is almost poetic in its irony. The greatest warrior of Christendom, killed by a lucky arrow from an unknown soldier in an insignificant castle. Fifth, Ricardo forces us to confront difficult questions about heroism and morality. Can we call someone a hero when he executed 2,700 unarmed prisoners? When he ruthlessly taxed his own people? When he abandoned his kingdom for years? The answer is not simple. Richard was a product of his time. By 12th century standards, executing prisoners was cruel but not uncommon. Taxing the kingdom to finance wars was a royal prerogative. Abandoning England to fight in the crusade was seen as noble, not irresponsible. Judging Richard by modern standards is anachronistic, but that doesn't mean we should ignore his atrocities. We can admire his courage and military genius while acknowledging his cruelty and irresponsibility. History isn't about choosing simple sides between heroes and villains. It's about understanding complex human beings in complex contexts. Richard's true legacy is perhaps his impact on English identity. Ironically, a king who barely spoke English, who spent only 6 months in England, who considered himself more French than English, became a symbol of English patriotism. For centuries, the English looked to Richard as the ideal king, brave, honourable, adventurous. This says more about the mythological needs of nations than about the historical Richard. Countries need founding heroes, larger-than-life figures to anchor national identity. Richard, with all his flaws and contradictions, served that purpose for England. Today, a statue of Richard the Lionheart stands in front of the Palace of Westminster in London. He is mounted on his war horse, sword raised, gazing defiantly into the future. Tourists take photos. Few know the real story. The ambiguities, the contradictions, the flaws. They see only the Lionheart, the warrior king, the heroic crusader. And perhaps that's okay. Myths have their place. They inspire, motivate, connect us to the past. But we must also know the truth behind the myths. Ricardo was human, brilliantly talented and tragically flawed. His heart was literally preserved in Rouen. For centuries, it remained untouched. In 2012, scientists finally examined the remains. They discovered that it had been embalmed with myrrh, frankincense, mercury, and other materials. Even in death, Richard received royal treatment, but the physical heart is not what matters. The true Lionheart lives in stories, in legends, in the collective imagination. It lives every time someone hears about the king who fought against Saladin, who defended Jaffa with 50 knights, who pardoned the man who killed him. Richard's life teaches us contradictory lessons. It teaches us about courage. He never backed down from a challenge, never showed fear. But it also teaches us about the dangers of pride. His recklessness cost him his life. It teaches us about leadership. Men would follow him to hell because he was always at the forefront. But it also teaches us about responsibility. He abandoned his kingdom and left it impoverished. If Richard could see how he is remembered today, would he be satisfied? Probably yes. He wanted eternal glory, and he got it. But perhaps he would also be frustrated. He wanted to be remembered as the conqueror of Jerusalem, and he failed. He wanted a lasting dynasty, but he had no heirs. He wanted his conquests to remain, but John lost everything in a few years. History has a cruel irony. Richard is remembered mainly in England, the country he loved least. He is forgotten in Aquitaine, his true homeland. His battles in France, where he spent most of his life, are less known than his brief campaign in the Holy Land. In the end, Richard the Lionheart was a man out of place and out of time. He lived like a knight-errant from courtly romances, but in an era that was already beginning to render that ideal obsolete. After his death, European kings gradually ceased to lead personally in battle. Warfare became more professional, more bureaucratic, less personal. Richard was one of the last great medieval warrior kings. After him, monarchs like Louis IX of France would wage crusades, but with less martial glory. Edward VIII of England would be a great military conqueror, but more calculating, less impulsive. The era of pure chivalry, if it ever truly existed, was ending. But the myth persists because we touch something deep in the human psyche. We want to believe in larger-than-life heroes. We want to believe that individual courage matters. We want to believe that there is nobility in struggle, even in wars that perhaps shouldn't be fought. Richard the Lionheart gives us that. Not every aspect of his life deserves admiration, but his undeniable courage, his military genius, his loyalty to his own principles, even when those principles were flawed, that resonates through the centuries. 800 years separate us from Richard. In that time, empires have risen and fallen, technologies have transformed the world, values have changed radically. But we still tell stories about the king who fought with the heart of a lion. We are still fascinated by the warrior who never gave up, who forgave his assassin, who died young in eternal glory. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart, Not the sanitized myth, but the real man, with all his contradictions and complexities. A brilliant warrior and a terrible king, a sensitive poet and a brutal executioner, a hero and a tyrant, a man of his time, impossible to replicate, impossible to forget. Its story ended 800 years ago in a smaller castle in France. But the legend lives on. And it will continue as long as there are people who appreciate courage, who dream of adventure, who understand that history is not about perfection, but about humanity in all its tragic and triumphant glory. Richard the Lionheart is dead. But the Lionheart will never die. If you've made it this far, leave a like and share this epic story. It helps the channel a lot.